The year I turned 58, I had been the administrator's second grade at Khavrek Station for 11 years, 4 months, and, by the time everything was finished, approximately 9 days more than I had originally planned to stay. Khavrek was a processing depot on the outer ring. That is the polite way to describe it. The honest way is to say it was a transit knot where cargo manifests went to age, where garrison requisition forms came in triplicate and were still wrong, and where the coffee dispensers in the main corridor had been malfunctioning since before I arrived, and would almost certainly continue malfunctioning after I left. The station was not glamorous. It processed 900 outbound cargo containers per standard month, managed 3 long-haul docking aprons, coordinated fuel transfers for 2 garrison routes, and employed approximately 400 staff who had all, at various points, expressed to me their intention to request a transfer. Most of them never did. There is something about a station that works, even inelegantly, that makes people stay. I had stayed. I had no particular plan to leave. My name is Corvan Reth, a frontier magistrate for 22 years before the depot work. I have held a judgeship on 4 different stations, overseen 2 complete administrative restructurings, and sat across a table from every species of difficult person that the consolidated outer territories can produce. I am not by disposition an excitable man. My second wife, Marta, gone 8 years now, used to say that my resting expression was identical to my emergency expression, and that this was either an asset or a personality defect, depending on the situation. She was usually right about things like that. I tell you all of this because when Commissioner Darya Tave arrived at Khavrek Station on the 14th day of the 3rd administrative quarter, I had no reason to expect anything beyond the routine bureaucratic friction that accompanies every central authority review. I had been through 4 of them. They were tedious. They produced recommendations that were partially implemented and then quietly forgotten. The depot ran. The paperwork moved. The coffee dispensers stayed broken. Nothing fundamental changed. Commissioner Tave was not a routine friction. She arrived with a 6-person administrative staff, 2 portable data terminals, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have already decided what they are going to find before they begin looking. She was perhaps 45, Volusian by her bone structure, compact and precise in her movements, and she wore the gray and copper trim of Central Authority's restructuring division, not the review division, restructuring. That distinction, I had learned over the years, matters. The first 3 days of her review went as I expected. Her staff pulled manifests, queried fuel transfer logs, interviewed department heads in a sequence that was clearly designed to build a picture of inefficiency before any picture was requested. Fully. There was nothing in those logs that concerned me. The depot ran within tolerance on every metric the restructuring division reasonably apply. What I did not know, until a supply runner named Osset pulled me aside on the 4th morning and said very quietly that he had heard something from the garrison transport that was docked in Apron 2, was that Tave had filed a secondary requisition the night she arrived. The requisition was for 3 Khavrek. I knew what Khavrek were. Anyone who had worked the outer ring for more than a year knew what Khavrek were. They were the garrison's frontier tracking and containment animals. Quadrupedal, chitinous armored over dark brindle hide, built low and wide across the shoulders, with sensor pits, where most creatures had eyes and a resonance organ in the chest cavity that could produce a sound at low frequency that human beings felt in their back teeth and their sternum before they consciously registered it as a sound at all. Each of them stood about chest high on me. Each of them weighed approximately twice what I did. They were used in pairs or brace groups of 3 for tracking escaped detainees, clearing hazardous wildlife from construction sites, and for the specific purpose of making very clear to a population of people that the entity deploying them meant what it said. The garrison kept a brace of 3 aboard their transport as standard. They were used perhaps twice a year in this sector. Every senior administrator on the outer ring knew the shape of that deployment, the official's requisition language, the clinical terminology, the careful paperwork distance between what was written and what was intended. Feral hazard clearance, the preferred phrasing. It had the virtue of being almost impossible to directly challenge, because you could not disprove the presence of a feral hazard without going out into the relevant area and demonstrating its absence, which was exactly where they wanted you to be. Tave had requisitioned the Khavrek for what her paperwork described as a feral hazard clearance in the outer processing yard. The outer processing yard did not have any feral hazards. I had walked it the morning before Osset spoke to me, as I walked it every morning, and the worst thing in it was a malfunctioning cargo arm that I had flagged for repair 17 days ago, and which was still, as of that morning, not repaired. No feral animals, no containment breach, no plausible justification for a Khavrek deployment. I went back to my office and sat with this information for approximately 40 minutes. Then I sent a communication to the garrison transport requesting the deployment manifest, which I was entitled to as the senior administrative officer of the station. The manifest came back within the hour. It listed the purpose as I had been told, feral hazard clearance, and listed the supervising administrator as Reth, C, administrator 2nd grade. She had filed my name on the deployment paperwork. The implication was not subtle. I was to go to the outer yard and supervise a clearance operation for which there were no feral hazards. 3 Khavrek that she had arranged to be there, alone, on a requisition that put my name as the responsible officer. If something happened to me in that yard, it would be recorded as an administrative accident on a routine clearance operation. If I refused to go, I would be in violation of the manifest I was listed on, which was grounds for a conduct review that Tave would be perfectly positioned to oversee. If I raised objection before the deployment, I would need to explain how I had obtained a copy of a garrison manifest that had not been officially transmitted to me. Ott had given me the information verbally. There was no record of it. I sat with all of this for another 20 minutes. Then I got my clipboard, checked the outer yard inspection form, and walked out. I want to be clear about what I was not doing. I was not being brave. I was not making a calculated gamble. I was not operating on some veteran's instinct about how Khavrek behave with humans. I had been near Khavrek exactly twice in my life. Once at a garrison demonstration on Crestfall Station, where I had watched from a respectful distance as a brace cleared a simulated detention breach in 4 minutes. And once on Meridian Reach, where a single Khavrek had tracked a cargo thief through 2 kilometers of maintenance tunnel. In neither case had I been within 30 meters of one. In neither case had there been any reason to think the creature was interested in anything I was doing. What I knew, sitting in that office, was this. I was 58 years old. I had been a magistrate, and then an administrator for most of my adult life. I'd worked 11 years on a station that was not glamorous, and which functioned, primarily, because I had made it function. I had no particular intention of being run off it by a woman from the restructuring division who had filed my name on a deployment manifest without my knowledge. That is the honest account of my state of mind. I was not calm from courage. I was calm from irritation, from a long habit of not showing irritation, and from the fact that I had spent enough of my life in difficult rooms to know that the worst thing you can do in a difficult room is let the other person see that it is difficult. I walked to the outer yard and I stood in the middle of it with my clipboard, and I waited. The yard was 300 meters at its longest axis, bounded by cargo stacks on 2 sides, and the station hull on the 3rd, open to the loading apron at the 4th, was gray and industrial and smelled of fuel exhaust and metal, and the particular flat mineral smell that outdoor spaces on transit stations always have. No soil, no organic decay, just metal and air recycling and the faint trace of whatever cargo had last moved through. The light was the standard depot yard light, which is to say adequate and cheerless. The garrison transport side hatch opened at the far end of the yard, near the loading apron. I watched it open. I stood still. Khavrek came through the hatch in a loose file, the lead one. I did not know it was called Solon at this point. I learned the name Lacer from the handler. Was perhaps a quarter-meter taller across the shoulders than the other 2. Its chitinous plating was darker. The amber sensor pits in its face, broader than those of its 2 companions. It moved with the specific quality of something that does not hurry, because hurrying is a concept for things that might not arrive in time. The garrison handler came through behind them and stopped just outside the hatch. I noticed she did not come into the yard. She stayed at the edge of it, at the hatch. The 3 Khavreks spread into the yard. The second and third ranged outward, moving in long, deliberate arcs across the gray floor. Sensor pits, sweeping the cargo stacks and the hull wall and the ground. They moved the way things move when they are reading a space rather than crossing it. Slow enough to process, fast enough to cover ground. The lead one moved directly toward the center, where I was standing, and it moved in a straight line. I did not move. This was not a particularly deliberate decision. It was more that there was nowhere sensible to move to, and that moving backward would have involved showing the thing my back, and that moving sideways would have required me to make a decision about that I did not have enough information to make correctly. So I stood where I was, clipboard in hand, and watched it come. It stopped at approximately 4 meters from me. This was close enough that I could hear the resonance organ very faintly, not the operational register which I was told later could make a person's vision blur, but a lower, slower pulse, almost subsonic, more like being aware of a deep vibration in the floor than hearing a sound. It looked at me with those amber pits. They were not eyes in any optical sense I understood. The handler told me afterward that they detected thermal gradient, motion differential, and certain kinds of chemical trace. What the Khavrek read from a person standing still 4 meters away, I do not know precisely. What I know is that it stood there and read me for approximately 90 seconds, and then it sat down. Not in the way a dog sits. Not settling or relaxing. More like a boulder that has decided where it is going to be for the foreseeable future. The second and third Khavrek, ranging across the far half of the yard, stopped what they were doing and looked at the lead one. There was a pause of perhaps 5 seconds. The second looked from the lead to me, and then back again. The third had gone very still near the cargo stacks on the south end of the yard, one foreleg forward. Sensor pits fixed on me, and whatever it was reading from the lead animal's posture and position was apparently sufficient, because after those 5 seconds, it released its stillness, and both of them came back toward the center and sat down, one to the lead's left and one behind. I stood there for another moment. Then I made a note on my clipboard. The inspection form required notation of any anomalies in the outer yard, and 3 Khavreks sitting in the middle of it seemed to qualify. And I turned and walked back to the depot office entrance. 3 Khavrek followed me. Not rushing, not flanking. Just following at a distance of perhaps 6 meters in a loose file, the lead one slightly ahead of the other 2. I reached the depot office entrance. I opened the door. I went in. I let the door close behind me, because it was an inner ring pressure door, and it closed automatically, regardless of what I thought about it. The 3 Khavrek sat down outside the door. I went to my desk. I wrote up the outer yard inspection report, noting that the feral hazard clearance had produced no confirmed feral hazards, and that 3 garrison Khavrek were currently at rest, adjacent to the depot office main entrance. I filed the report through the standard administrative channel. Then I made myself a cup of the bad coffee and drank it, because I had earned it. I sent a short communication to the garrison transport, notifying them that their animals were outside my office door, and that I would appreciate someone coming to collect them at their earliest convenience. Nobody came. I found out later that the handler, her name was Sergeant Yeva Koln, and she turned out to be a decent person, had tried. She had gone to the depot office entrance, spoken to the Khavrek, given the recollect tone on her emitter, done everything she was trained to do. The lead Khavrek had looked at her. The lead Khavrek had then looked at the door. The lead Khavrek had done nothing else. Sergeant Koln had gone back to the transport and reported this to her garrison commanding officer. The garrison commanding officer had reported it to Commissioner Tave. I was not part of that conversation. I learned its content over the following 2 days, secondhand, from Osset, who had apparently made it his personal mission to keep me informed of things happening in corridors I was not walking through. I did not ask him to do this, but I found it useful. What I was part of that evening was the outer yard door opening and the lead Khavrek walking through it. The depot office had an outer yard door, a heavy cargo door, standard for transit depots, not usually operated from outside. This one had a mechanical release lever on the exterior face. intended for emergency access in case of interior fire suppression lockdown. The lever required 17 kilograms of lateral force to operate. I had never had occasion to test how much force a Khavrek foreleg was capable of producing. The answer, it turned out, considerably more than 17 kilograms. The lead Khavrek came through the door, looked around the depot office with those amber sensor pits, located me at my desk, and walked over and lay down on the floor between my desk and the inner wall. The second and third Khavrek came through the door behind it. The second positioned itself near the main entrance, settling into a low crouch that I would come to recognize as her default watchful posture. Not resting, not alert in the operational sense. Somewhere in between, the posture of something that was tracking multiple variables at once, without being agitated by any of them. The third went to the area near the supply shelves along the far wall, looked around that corner of the room with methodical care, and then sat, and after a moment looked at me. I looked at all three of them. I looked at the outer yard door, which they had not damaged. The lever and the door frame were intact. The door had been opened cleanly. I turned back to my work. I was reviewing a fuel transfer discrepancy that had been sitting on my desk for 4 days, and which I had been putting off because involved 3 separate manifest formats from 3 different filing systems, and reconciling them required the kind of sustained attention that the day's events had temporarily reduced my capacity for. I worked through it now with the 3 Khavrek quiet in the room. The lead one was breathing slowly. I could see its flank moving in the corner of my vision. It did not smell bad. Smelled like cool metal and something faintly resinous, like the wax they put on cargo seal strips. After about 20 minutes, I stopped noticing it was there and finished the discrepancy report. I had a meal at my desk, as I often did. A standard ration pack from the office dispenser, nothing notable. The lead Khavrek raised its head when I opened the pack. I looked at it. It looked at me. I considered the situation. I pulled out the protein component of the ration, a compressed block of something the ration designers optimistically called savory, and broke off a piece and set it on the floor within the creature's reach. It ate the piece. Then it looked at me again. I gave it the rest of the protein block. It ate that too. Then it put its head back down. The other 2 had watched this transaction with the focused attention of observers taking notes. The second, near the main entrance, had lifted her head and tracked the entire exchange without moving from her crouch. The third, near the supply shelves, had gone very still in the way animals go still when something in the environment shifts and they want to read the shift before responding to it. Neither of them approached. Neither of them did anything. The dynamic within the brace was clear enough, even to someone with no particular expertise in Khavrek behavior. The lead one had an arrangement. The other 2 were waiting to see how it developed. I finished my meal, made a note in my personal log, not the official one, the one I kept for my own reference, that Sergeant Coln should be consulted about appropriate dietary items for the animals, and went back to work. Commissioner Tave sent me a formal, written communication the following morning. It was polite in tone and precise in language, and informed me that the Khavrek deployment was complete, and that the garrison transport was prepared, cover the animals, and that my cooperation in facilitating their return to Apron 2 would be appreciated. The communication was copied to Central Authority's Depot Operations Division and to the garrison commanding officer, back, that I would be delighted to cooperate, and that, as I had also communicated the previous evening, the animals were currently in my office, and that Sergeant Coln was welcome to come and collect them at any point. Sergeant Coln came within the hour. She stood in my doorway, which currently had 2 Khavrek, occupying roughly a third of it, and looked at the situation in the office, and then looked at me. Administrator Reth, she said. Her voice was careful. Sergeant, I said, thank you for coming promptly. She looked at the lead Khavrek, who had raised its head, and was regarding her with those amber pits from its position next to my desk. Have they been? She paused. Has anything? They've been completely quiet, I said. No damage to anything. Solon. I had learned the name by then, from the garrison's animal registry that I had looked up the previous evening. Ate a portion of my ration, team block last night, which I understand may not be optimal nutrition. I meant to ask you about that. Sergeant Coln's mouth did something complex. She ate from your hand? From the floor, I said. I didn't think it appropriate to reach directly. Coln was quiet for a moment. She looked at Solon. She looked at me. She said, Administrator, may I try the recollect tone? Of course, I said. Though I should tell you she didn't respond to it yesterday. Coln raised her emitter. She produced the tone. It was a subsonic pulse, with a frequency I felt in my chest rather than heard. All three Khavrek looked at her. The second and third held their positions. Solon looked at her steadily, and then looked at me, and then looked at the door behind Coln, and then put her head back down. The look at the door lasted approximately 2 seconds. It was not a threatening look. It was more the look of something identifying the relevant geography and confirming that it already knows what is on the other side. Coln lowered the emitter. That's... She stopped. She was looking at Solon with an expression I recognized from my years on the bench, the expression of someone revising a significant assumption. Administrator, she said, after a moment. How long have you worked with Khavrek? I haven't, I said. I've been near them twice in my life, both at a distance. I have no training with them whatsoever. Must have done something, she said. She was not accusing me. She was working something out. I stood in the yard, I said. I didn't move. She thought about that for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, she established anchor. I did not know what that meant at the time. I asked her. She explained that Khavrek are hunting and tracking animals that operate in brace groups, and that within a brace, the lead animal periodically designates what their handlers call an anchor, a fixed point in space, or a fixed individual, relative to which the orients its protective behavior. In wild populations, anchors are typically territory markers, nest sites, food sources. In garrison deployment, the anchor is supposed to be the designated handler. Solon anchored you, Coln said. Why would she do that? Coln looked at Solon for a moment. Solon had closed her sensor pits, not sleeping exactly, but resting in the specific way of things that they don't need to track their environment at the moment. In my experience, Coln said carefully, she does it when she decides something or someone is worth holding. I considered this. I wrote it in my personal log later that evening. Worth holding. I was not sure what to do with that information, but it seemed important to have recorded it. What happens if she's forced to leave the anchor? I asked. Coln's expression was answer enough before she spoke. You don't force a designated anchor separation, she said. Not with an established brace. Not unless you want. She stopped. The garrison does not recommend it, formally. That seems like useful information, I said. I'll put it in my report. Coln left without the Khavrek. The next 5 days were interesting in ways I had not expected. The practical difficulty with having 3 Khavrek installed in one's office is primarily spatial. My depot office was not small, but it was not designed to accommodate 3 draft animal-sized predators in addition to a desk, 4 filing terminals, 2 visitor chairs, and the particular accumulation of physical paperwork that 15 years in administrative work produces. Solon established herself next to my desk within 18 hours, and treated that position as settled fact. Keth, the second Khavrek, I had looked up all their designations by this point, positioned herself across the threshold of the outer yard door. Brass, the youngest and smallest, took the area near the inner wall where the supply shelves were, and seemed content to observe proceedings from there. My staff's reactions ranged from Osset, who appeared in my doorway the second morning, looked at all 3 Khavrek, said, right then, and went back to his work without further comment, to my deputy administrator Helm Vrask, stood frozen in the doorway for 40 seconds before finding her voice and asking whether she should file an incident report. I told her to hold the incident report pending further developments. She nodded and went to her station, and I noticed that she chose the workstation farthest from the door for the remainder of the week. The Khavrek were not disruptive in any way I had anticipated. They did not damage anything. They did not threaten staff who came through, though staff gave them wide berth, which was reasonable. And after the first 2 days, Keth had apparently decided the outer yard door threshold was satisfactorily covered and moved to a position near the main entrance instead, which was objectively a more efficient defensive angle. I noticed this and thought it showed good judgment. Brass, meanwhile, had begun a systematic investigation of the supply shelf area that consisted of slowly, methodically examining every item on those shelves with her sensor pits at close range. She did not disturb anything. She appeared to be cataloging. When she had finished the shelves, she moved to the filing cabinet corners, then the space beneath the visitor chairs, then the air recycling vent housings. After 3 days, she apparently satisfied herself that the room was what it appeared to be, and settled into a posture near the foot of my desk that put her in sight lines to both doors simultaneously. I noted this in my personal log. She was doing what a good administrator does when entering an unfamiliar station. Building a complete picture before committing to a position. Solon ate from my hand by the 3rd day. Not ration protein block. Sergeant Colm had sent over a supply of the garrison's standard Khavrek dietary supplement, which came in large compressed blocks that smelled like dried fish and something ferrous, and which Solon accepted with the same matter-of-fact composure she brought to everything. She ate it cleanly and without fuss. She weighed approximately twice what I did, and she could have taken my hand off at the wrist without any particular effort, and she ate from my hand with the care of something that understood the difference between what it could do and what it chose to do. I noted this too. I noted a lot of things in that period, more than I usually do. I think what was happening was that I was in a situation I did not fully understand, and the way I have always dealt with not understanding a situation is to watch it carefully until I understand it better. Commissioner Tave escalated on the 4th day. She sent a formal requisition, through the proper channels this time, suggested she had learned something from the first deployment not going as planned, requesting that the garrison transport take possession of its animals by force if necessary. The garrison committee officer, a lieutenant commander named Sooth Orion, wrote back that he was amenable in principle, but that his sergeant had assessed the situation and his garrison protocol did not authorize forced anchor separation on an established brace without written authorization from a central authority medical officer, on the grounds that the resulting behavioral response from the brace was classified as an unpredictable hazard under garrison standing orders. Tave requested a central authority medical officer. The nearest one was 6 standard days out, minimum. I learned all of this from Osset and from 2 subsequent formal communications that were copied to my office as the station's senior administrative officer, which meant, incidentally, that Tave's escalation was creating a paper trail that included me in every step, and that I had clean record of every action taken. I did not think this had been her intent. It was producing documentation that I found useful to have. On the 5th day, Dr. Elif Sen came to my office. Dr. Sen was Halvek Station's biology and xenofauna specialist, a position that on most transit depots exists primarily to process cargo manifests for live animal shipments and to sign off on the quarterly environmental hygiene reports. She was Velusian, small and precise in her movements, and I had worked with her for 3 years without ever having much occasion to speak with her beyond the quarterly reports. She asked, through my communications terminal, whether she might observe the Khavrek in C2, as she had a professional interest in the behavioral observation. I said yes. She stood in the doorway of my office for approximately 20 minutes, making no sound and very little movement. Solon acknowledged her arrival with a single sensor pit sweep, and then ignored her. Keth did not look up from the main entrance. Brass turned to observe Sen for perhaps 30 seconds, and then resumed her established watch on both doors. Sen watched all 3 of them, with the methodical attention of someone who knows exactly what they are looking for. When she left, she paused at the doorway and said, very quietly, almost to herself, "Measured ground." I asked her what the term meant. She said she would explain properly later, and she did, over coffee in the corridor outside. Measured ground. The territory the lead animal has assessed as worth holding, from which the brace will not be moved. She said it occurred rarely with garrison animals. She said the garrison's own protocols classified it under a code that essentially meant, do not attempt to countermand this. The documentation process for resolving it takes 6 weeks, and the Animal Welfare Board will ask uncomfortable questions. She told me she was going to file a preliminary behavioral assessment in the garrison animal welfare database, as was her professional obligation. I did not ask her to expedite it. She filed it that afternoon, dated from the morning of her observation, was day 3 of the Bryce's presence in my office. 5 days before Tave's personnel removal order arrived. I thanked her for explaining. She said there was nothing to thank her for, she was a scientist, and this was a notable behavioral case. I said I understood. I thought I probably did. On the 6th day, TAV filed for a personnel removal order through Central Authority administrative channels. Personnel removal order under our territories code required 48 hours notice and had to be executed by administrative officers of equal or higher rank than the officer being removed. She listed 2 of her staff members as the executing officers, which technically satisfied the equal rank requirement, and set the execution time for the 48th hour. I had the notification in my communications terminal by mid-morning. I read it twice. I forwarded a copy to my personal archive. I wrote a 6-line notation in my official log about the manner in which the removal order had been filed and the relevant procedural codes, and I CC'd the Central Authority Depot Operations Oversight Board on the notation, which I was entitled to do as a station administrator facing a removal action. The Oversight Board was 12 light hours away and would not be reading their communications for some time. But the timestamp would be there, and the timestamp was the point. There is a thing that happens sometimes in administrative proceedings, which I had observed from the bench, and which I was now observing from the other side. The accumulation of correct individual actions producing a collectively incorrect result. Tave had done nothing improper, technically, at any individual step. The feral hazard requisition was within her authority to file. Listing me on the manifest was administratively irregular but not unlawful. The removal order was properly executed under the relevant code. What she had not accounted for, I thought, was the way that each correct step created a record, and that the record of a sequence of actions tells a story that the actions themselves do not individually tell. The Oversight Board, reading my notation, and the removal order, and the garrison's animal welfare communication, and Dr. Sen's assessment, would read a story. I had made sure the story was readable. I did not think this with satisfaction. I thought it the way I think most things about administrative process, with the tired, dry recognition that it is the process we have, and that it functions approximately as well as most human-made systems, is to say imperfectly, but usually adequately. And that you work within it because the alternative is not working within it, produces worse results. Then I went and sat with the Khavrek for a while. This was not, strictly speaking, a professional activity, but the quarters I used at Khavrek were adjacent to the depot office. I had always found it efficient to live close to the work, and after 11 years, the depot office felt more like where I lived than the quarters did. Solon had taken to sleeping across the doorway between the office and the quarters side in the evenings, which meant that when I came through to the office in the mornings I had to step over her, and she would wake when I did and look at me with those amber pits, and then put her head back down once I was past. It had become, in the space of 6 days, a routine. I was aware that this was strange. I was also aware that I did not find it strange in the way I probably should have. I sat at my desk. Solon was beside it, Keth near the entrance, Brass between the desk and the far wall, in her chosen position with sight lines to both doors. The fuel allocation report was still open on my terminal. The Khavrek were quiet. Station hummed. I worked. The 48 hours ran out at midday on day 8. Tave sent 6 people. Her own administrative staff plus 2 transit security officers who had been detailed to the depot from the station's outer ring security post. It was the largest force she could field under the procedural rules governing administrative removal actions, which do not allow for armed personnel beyond escort duty. So the transit security officers were unarmed, carrying only their ID wands and their rank insignia. They were also, I noticed as they came down the main loading corridor toward the depot office, not particularly large, and, at least 2 of them, looked like they would have preferred to be somewhere else. The removal order required me to vacate the depot office and accompany the executing officers to a holding room pending central authorities' disposition of my administrative file. It was a legitimate order under the code Tave had cited. I had reviewed the code carefully, There was nothing procedurally incorrect about what she had done. I was sitting at my desk when they arrived. Solon was in her place beside the desk. Keth was near the main entrance. Brass had moved. I noticed this at some point in the morning and had not tried to predict what it meant to a position directly beside the corridor door, which was the entrance they would come through. Sitting with her full body oriented toward that door, not the room. She had moved there of her own accord, before the 6 people came down the corridor. The Khavrek read something in the station's environment. Vibration, sound pattern, chemical trace through the air recycling, that I did not have the equipment to detect. She had known they were coming before I heard their footsteps. The transit security officer in front opened the corridor door. He got it open approximately 40 centimeters. Brass was standing at the inside of that door. She had risen from her sitting position at some point in the final moments before the door opened, silently. And she was standing now with her full weight distributed, and her chitinous shoulder plates squared toward the gap and her sensor pits fixed on the transit security officer's face. She did not advance. She did not vocalize. The resonance from her chest organ was the low subsonic that I had come to recognize as the brace's resting register. But it wasn't quite resting. It was the tone that sits at the low end of operational, without crossing into it. The sound that fills a room before anything happens. The door held at 40 centimeters. The transit security officer looked through the gap at Brass. He held the door at 40 centimeters for perhaps 15 seconds. Then he said something to the person behind him in a low voice, and the door went back to 30 centimeters and stayed there. I could hear the conversations in the corridor, though not clearly enough to follow it exactly. What I could tell was that it involved the door and the animal behind it, and that there was some disagreement about what should happen next, and that the disagreement was not resolving quickly. From where I sat, I had a partial view through the gap. The transit security officer's shoulder, 2 of Tave's administrative staff visible behind him, all of them in the corridor, none of them moving toward the door. Brass had not moved. She was not growling. She was not displaying in any overtly aggressive fashion. She was simply standing at the inside of the door in the manner of something that has chosen where it is going to be, and is confident in that choice. The resonance from her chest organ continued at that low register, steady and even. Since read enough of the garrison's Khavrek behavioral literature to know that the operational resonance, the one that blurs vision and reduces the involuntary muscular response in most species, operates at a frequency approximately 30% higher than what Brass was, producing in that corridor. She was not threatening them, she was informing them. The distinction is meaningful, and I suspect at least one person in that corridor understood it intuitively, even without knowing the technical literature. It went on for approximately 7 minutes. Then the door opened wider, 45 centimeters, 50, and Commissioner Tave came through the gap herself. She had decided, I think, that if her people wouldn't go through, she would go through, and that her authority was sufficient to make the point even without them. This was a reasonable reading of the situation as a matter of leverage. It was not a complete reading of the situation. Brass stepped back as she came through, not retreating, adjusting, the way a defensive position adjusts when the threat moves. The 6 people behind her in the corridor did not come through. The door stayed at 50 centimeters, and then gently closed to about 35, as Tave moved away from it into the office. Tave stood in the office. Solon was beside my desk. Keth was near the main entrance, which was on the perpendicular wall from the corridor door. She was on her feet now, not in the crouch posture, fully upright and oriented. Brass was to Tave's left, approximately 2 meters, and she had not moved from the position she'd taken when the door opened. Tave had walked into a room with 3 Khavrek, alone, and the geometry of the room meant that she was equidistant from all 3 of them. She looked at me. Administrator Reth, the removal order has been filed, and the execution period has elapsed. You are requested to vacate this office and accompany. Commissioner, I said. Before we continue, I want to make sure you have Dr. Sen's behavioral assessment in your file. She paused. What assessment? The one filed on day 3 of the garrison animal deployment, I said. It's in the garrison animal welfare database. It may not have been transmitted to your administrative file automatically. The garrison and central authority run separate filing systems is one of the inefficiencies in this depot's operations that I expect your review will want to note. I can have Osset pull the document number if that would help. Tave was looking at me with the rapid calculation expression again. Does the assessment say? Dr. Sen would be the appropriate person to characterize it, I said. But in general terms, it documents a measured ground designation from the lead garrison Khavrek as of day 3 of the deployment. Understand the garrison's own protocols have specific procedural requirements for situations involving a measured ground designation. Lieutenant Commander Orion would be the right person to explain the details. There was a silence in the room, not a long one, perhaps 20 seconds. But it was the kind of silence that has weight in it, the kind that happens when a very careful person is revising a very significant assumption. Solon had raised her head and was looking at Tave with those amber sensor pits. Not threatening, just looking, reading her the way she had read me in the yard on the first day, with that same steady, unhurried attention. The resonance from Solon's chest was very low and very steady. The removal order is lawful, Tave said. I have no doubt of that, I said. The question is whether it can be executed without coming into conflict with garrison animal welfare protocols, which are also lawful and which have documentation in the system that predates your order by 5 days. That's a question for the relevant authorities to determine. I would suggest, in the interest of everyone's time, that it be determined before anyone tries to move through that door again. Tave looked at me. She looked at Solon. She looked at the corridor door, which was at 35 centimeters, and behind which her 6 people were presumably still standing in a corridor, having learned something that morning about what they were, and were not willing to push through. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, I'll be filing a formal objection to the behavioral assessment. That's absolutely your right, said. The appeal process under Garrison Animal Welfare Code is, I understand, roughly 6 weeks. During that period, I believe the garrison's own protocols would classify any forced displacement of the brace as an unpredictable hazard event. Dr. Sen could clarify the details. Tave went to the corridor door. She pushed it open. She went through it. Her 6 people were still in the corridor, arranged in a loose group that had clearly stopped believing in the efficiency of what they had been sent to do. She said something to them, too quietly for me to hear. They left. I sat in the office for a few minutes after they had gone. Solon put her head back down. Brass returned to the position near the supply shelves. Keth, near the main entrance, settled back into her crouch. The resonance from all 3 of them went quiet. I made a note in my personal log. Day 8. Removal action attempted, not executed. Shh, I added. Brass demonstrated good positional judgment, consistent with the pattern I've observed over the past several days. She had moved before they arrived. She was ready. Then I went back to the quarterly fuel allocation report, which was now overdue by 11 days, and which was not going to improve by being left longer. The subsequent events for the record were these. Lieutenant Commander Orion communicated to Central Authority's Depot Operations Division that his garrison's animal welfare protocols were implicated in the removal action, and that he could not authorize execution of the order without written clearance from the Garrison Welfare Board. Central Authority's Depot Operations Division, which had been copied on my log notation from Day 6, requested clarification from Commissioner Tave's office on the chain of events. Dr. Sen's behavioral assessment was formally transmitted to all relevant parties. Sergeant Coln submitted a supplementary handler's report that documented the measured ground designation in precise technical language and noted that, in her 11 years of working with Khavrek, she had observed the designation established with a non-Heller human exactly twice, and that both prior cases had involved individuals the brace subsequently accompanied through the entirety of their assessed territorial range. Central Authority suspended the restructuring review pending a procedural audit of the removal order. The audit was filed on Day 12. Commissioner Tave, on Day 15, was recalled Central Authority on an unrelated matter, or so the communication said, which is the administrative equivalent of being asked to leave quietly and given a reason to do so. She departed Khavrek station on the morning transport. I was doing the morning inspection of the outer yard when she left, which was where I was every morning at that hour, so I did not see her go. The brace stayed. This became a matter requiring some formal resolution, since garrison animals are not normally allocated to civilian depot stations as permanent fixtures. The resolution took approximately 3 weeks of correspondence between Lieutenant Commander Orion, Dr. Sen, Sergeant Coln, Central Authority's Animal Welfare Division, and my own office. The correspondence was, in my experience, more efficiently conducted than most three-party administrative negotiations I have been part of, which I attributed in part to all parties having a practical interest in a workable outcome, and in part to Sergeant Coln being remarkably good at cutting through procedure knots when she chose to be. The outcome was a secondment arrangement. The brace would remain at Khavrek Station under Coln's handler authority, with Reth, C. Administrator 2nd grade, formally registered as designated anchor for the lead animal, with the 2nd and 3rd animals listed as co-anchor associates. The garrison would maintain welfare oversight. Dr. Sen would provide quarterly behavioral assessments. The fuel costs for supplemental animal rations would be absorbed into the depot's standard operating budget, which I noted in my next quarterly report without particular emphasis. Coln came to brief me on the arrangement the morning it was finalized. She sat across from me at the desk, Solon to my right, Keth near the door, Brass near the supply shelves, and went through the documentation with the care of someone who had spent significant effort making it work. "There's one thing I want to note," she said when she had finished the briefing. "Off the record." "Of course," I said. She looked at Solon for a moment. Solon had her eyes half closed in the morning rest posture, and her flank moved slowly. "She's never anchored a non-helder before," Coln said. "In 11 years. I've read the case files for the other 2 instances. Both of them," she paused. "The documentation describes them as individuals with a specific behavioral profile. Stable, low effect. High capacity for stillness under pressure." "That sounds like a polite description," I said. Coln looked at me. "It's an accurate one. Solon registers. What triggers the anchor designation isn't strength exactly. It's not aggression. It's not training. She thought for a moment. It's the absence of pretense, I think. Animals that hunt by reading thermal and chemical trace, they're very good at detecting the gap between what a creature presents and what it actually is. Most people, in high-pressure situations, close that gap in one direction or the other. They're either more afraid than they show, or they're projecting more authority than they have. What she read in you, standing in that yard, was consistency. You showed was what you were. I thought about standing in that yard with my clipboard, irritated about having my name put on someone else's paperwork, not moving because there was nowhere sensible to move to. "That's a very generous interpretation," I said. "It's the only interpretation that fits the behavior," she said. I thought about that for a while after she left. I am still thinking about it, in the way that you turn a thing over in your mind, not because you disagree with it, but because it has more sides than you can see at once. What I know is this. Khavrek Station is still a processing depot on the outer ring. It is still not glamorous. The cargo arms still need maintenance. Coffee dispensers in the main corridor are still malfunctioning. 900 containers go out per standard month, give or take, and the fuel transfer logs are still in 3 different manifest formats, and the paperwork still arrives in triplicate and is still wrong. I still walk the outer yard every morning. The morning inspection, the same form I have been filling out for 11 years, the same notations in the same boxes. The difference is that now I walk it with Solon to my left, and Keth to my right, and Brass ranging slightly ahead. And when I stop to make a notation, the 3 of them stop too, and when I move on, they move with me, and the yard is very quiet in the early station cycle, just the hum of the processors, and the exhaust smell, and the flat mineral air, and nothing in it moves without being part of what we are doing. The cargo stacks are the same stacks. The malfunctioning cargo arm has been repaired, finally, which I noted in the inspection log, with the specific satisfaction of a notation that has been waiting to be made for a long time. The loading apron hatch at the far end is where it always was. The light is still adequate and cheerless. But I walk the yard differently now. Perhaps. I always walked it this way, and now there is something to show it. There is a quality of attention in those three animals moving with me that I find unexpectedly clarifying. They read the space the way I read a log. Completely, without assumption, noting every variance. I have started to see things I had stopped seeing. A stress fracture in the hull, plating along the south wall that I had walked past for months. A drainage issue in the northwest corner that I had attributed to general wear, and watched that turn be a blocked runoff. That 2 hours of maintenance work resolved. The yard is the same yard. I am paying different attention to it. The depot staff have adjusted. Ossett calls them the inspection committee. With the dry humor of a person who has seen enough not to be surprised by anything, and who nonetheless finds things worth noting. Deputy Administrator Vrask has stopped choosing the farthest workstation. She brings Brass, specifically, piece of whatever she has for her mid-morning meal, and Brass now moves from her position near the supply shelves to the threshold of Vrask's work area every mid-morning with the precision of something that has learned a schedule. I have not commented on this to Vrask. It seems like something she worked out on her own, and the Khavrek appear to have worked it out with her, and I have learned enough in the past months not to assume that the arrangement requires my involvement to function. Sergeant Coln stops by once a standard month on the garrison route. She checks the brace's welfare documentation, updates the handler logs, makes small adjustments to the dietary supplement protocol as needed. She drinks the bad coffee without complaint. She and I have the quiet companionship of two people who have both, in their different ways, spent a lot of time watching animals make sense of the world, and found it mostly instructive. She told me once, on her third visit, Solon's health metrics were the best she had logged for any animal in the garrison's roster in 6 years. I said that surprised me. Coln said it didn't surprise her at all. The depot runs. The quarterly reports go out on time, mostly. The fuel transfer discrepancies get reconciled. Ossett continues to manage the supply runner schedule with the particular talent for keeping things in order quietly, without requiring anyone to notice that he is doing it. That I have valued in him for years. Vrask has proven to be a better deputy administrator than I had assessed. I have revised my assessment upward several times in the past months, and I believe I owe her a formal performance notation to that effect, which I have been drafting and which I will file before the end of this quarter. The coffee dispensers are still broken. I have submitted the repair request for the 19th time. I have some reason to believe it will be addressed before the 20th. Solon still sleeps across the doorway between the office and my quarters. Every morning I step over her, and she wakes and looks at me and then puts her head back down. It is the first thing I do every day, and it is, in the way that small reliable things become reliable. Precisely because they are small. One of the things I look forward to. Measured ground. That is what Dr. Sen called it in her quiet voice, watching from the doorway of my office on day 3. The territory the lead animal has assessed as worth holding, and from which the brace will not be moved. I have thought about that phrase often in the months since. I am a person who spends considerable time with terminology, in magistrate work, in administrative work. The name you give a thing shapes how you handle it, and the precision of the name is worth investing in. Measured ground is a precise name. It does not say protected territory, which would imply that the protection comes from outside. It does not say claimed territory, which would imply ownership. It says measured, assessed, evaluated, found to be of a specific value, and that value confirmed. The ground earns its name by being what it is. The protection follows from the assessment, not the other way around. I did not ask to be assessed. I did not present myself for evaluation. I walked into a yard with a clipboard and stood still because there was nowhere sensible to walk to, and I thought about a fuel transfer discrepancy, and I did not perform anything. I was irritated and quiet, and I did not move. And something very old and very good at reading the truth of things looked at me and decided I was holding. I have kept that. I intend to go on keeping it.